This is part one of a two-part series ranking all 50 US states by best to live in for roller coasters. At the beginning of 2021, you might recall a video I made ranking every US state by coaster collection. That list was based off of the states lineup and that's it, so while it was a well-received video, it seemed like half the comments were talking about nearby parks not within a state's borders. A prime example of this would be California, which I would consider to have the best roller coaster collection in the country. However, if you look around the Golden State, Nevada, Arizona, and Oregon have very lackluster lineups. The proximity of theme parks in and around the state will ultimately determine these rankings, which means spoiler alert, California is not the number one spot. This video is for those of you looking at places to move to or visit but only care about roller coasters and nothing else. In all seriousness, it'll be an exciting little series, so be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss part 2 when it debuts in a few days. With that being said, this is part 1 of the top 50 US states to live in for roller coasters. This video will bring spots 50 to 25, starting with a couple that are interesting in that they either have nothing much or have to rely on their surrounding states to bolster their rankings. And last place kicking off the list is Hawaii, which is pretty self-explanatory. The only time the state ever has any coasters is during the state fair, and that usually only happens in Oahu. Otherwise, there isn't a single permanent coaster in Hawaii, and it doesn't help that it's so far from the mainland, so there aren't any surrounding states to help them out. Another state in a similar situation is number 49, Alaska. Just this last year, Alaska got their first permanent roller coaster in Aftershock at the Alaska State Fair. This is a Cyclone coaster, so nothing too special at all, but it is something that Hawaii doesn't have. Similarly, this is quite far from the mainland, and it's not like there's anything in the Yukon province of Canada to help them out either. Heading on over to the lower 48, we have Nebraska. This state alone has a couple kiddie coasters, and its surroundings don't help much. That said, its biggest city, Omaha, is only a 2-hour drive away from Adventureland in Iowa, which I would say is a pretty decent park for roller coasters. At number 47, we head over to North Dakota, a state known for nothing much. I mean, there's not really much going on in North Dakota. The same can absolutely be said about their coasters, or coaster if you will, because all the state has on offer is a singular kiddie coaster. If you happen to live in the Fargo area, you are 3.5 hours from Minneapolis, which is a reasonable drive, but otherwise you'll have to settle for nothing much. And what do you know, number 46 is the other Dakota, South Dakota. This one is a little better given it has a few mountain coasters, but like its northern neighbor, if you want some real coasters, you'll have to take the 3.5-hour drive to Minneapolis. Spot number 45 takes us to Louisiana, who don't have the mountain coasters of South Dakota, but compensate in their surrounding states. Lucky for them, they border Texas, one of the best US states for roller coasters. Unlucky for them, Texas is absolutely huge, and the only reasonably close city is Houston with just 2 major coasters. At a similar distance is also the few coasters of Alabama, but that does require you to drive through Mississippi, which kinda sucks. Another state that's pretty sucky for roller coasters is New Mexico. This one does offer a CCI wooden coaster in New Mexico Rattler, but after that you'll have to settle with your neighboring state, which there still isn't much. If you live here, stick to your Cliffs Park season pass because marathoning the Rattler is basically all you've got going for you. Going quite remote, Wyoming is our 43rd state on this list, and it's a pretty unfortunate state to live in if you like roller coasters. Because it's a pretty big state, your options will vary depending on where you live. In the southern portion, you aren't too far from Colorado's amusement parks, and in the southwestern part of Wyoming, you are pretty close to Lagoon in Utah. It's just important to take into account that if you live literally anywhere else in the state, you might be screwed with your options. Another state you could be screwed living in is Montana, because it is freaking massive. If you happen to be in the gorgeous western part of the state, you are very close to Silverwood in Idaho, which is an amazing theme park. But anywhere else, and I have some unfortunate news to tell you. Back in the southern United States is spot number 41, Mississippi. Sadly, this state only has one small coaster, and it's only open a couple days a year. The good news is you aren't impossibly far from Dollywood in Tennessee, which is a worth it drive for one of the best parks in the world. You're also reasonably close to the parks in Alabama. If you're willing to drive a little bit further, you can also get to Six Flags Over Georgia. At first glance, Mississippi might seem like the worst of the worst states to live in as a coaster enthusiast, but if you've got a car and can drive, there honestly could be worse places. Coming in at number 40 is one of my absolute favorite states, Oregon. This state has a pretty lacking collection of coasters, but still easily a superior lineup to the past few states. The main drawback is that there isn't much around Oregon to drive to. Silverwood is a good 6 hours away from the Portland area, so that is an option. There's also the few Washington credits a few hours north, but just think about how sad it would be if you lived in South Oregon. You would literally have no options. Speaking of, our next state might really surprise some people, and that's because our 39th state is actually Kansas. Now, I won't lie, under many circumstances, you will have very minimal options for coasters. However, if you live on the Kansas side of Kansas City, you actually have it pretty great. This makes for the opportunity to visit Worlds of Fun, Silver Dollar City, Adventureland in Iowa, and Six Flags St. Louis. Now, if you live in the Wichita area, things aren't quite as good, but still not the worst thing in the world. You'll be looking at a 2-hour drive to Frontier City in Oklahoma and 5 hours to Six Flags Over Texas. Really, you'll want to hit the gold mine of being in Kansas City, but if not, your options may be severely limited. Not too far away is spot number 38, which is Arkansas. Along with having Magic Springs in the Little Rock Hot Springs region, you are also probably 3.5 hours from Silver Dollar City, give or take. Now, these conditions aren't so bad, but what could be bad is if you're stuck in the southern Arkansas region, which is pretty pretty brutal. Another up on our list is back up to the northwest for Washington. I think I'd say Washington has a slightly better coaster lineup than Oregon, plus they happen to be a bit closer to Silverwood with a 5-hour drive from Seattle and only 1 hour from Spokane. Additionally, if you have a passport, you also aren't too far from Playland and Vancouver, Canada, so that vintage coaster might also be of interest. A similar situation to Washington is state number 36, Idaho. If you live in the northern part of the state, you basically have the same options as Washington, but maybe slightly better since you have Silverwood in your backyard. If you're living in the southern half, take Boise for example, that is a big red flag. Moving on over to spot number 35, we've got sunny Arizona. Now the Phoenix area doesn't have as much as I think it should considering its population, but castles and coasters plus the new Hot Wheels park are at least something. What really makes Arizona not as bad as it may seem is the fact that you got Southern California a 5-hour drive away. I think an argument can be made for this being the best region of the country for roller coasters, and although you have to drive a distance to get there, you will absolutely be rewarded. Just north of Arizona is state 34, Utah. If you happen to live near Salt Lake City, you'll have easy access to the lagoon and a couple of nearby mountain coasters. Unfortunately, Southern California is now quite a bit further, but I could see someone taking the drive to next door Colorado. This especially goes for Glenwood Caverns, which is about 5 hours from Salt Lake. Now again, we're going to be jumping the border for the next one, which is number 33, Nevada. Considering most of the state is desert, you aren't going to find much in terms of roller coasters. Even the Las Vegas area isn't as coaster heavy as you'd think it would be. Like Arizona though, you aren't too far from the Southern California area, which is a hotspot for theme parks. Plus, if you're in the Lake Tahoe region, you're only 2.5 hours from the Northern California parks, which ultimately puts it above the prior two states. Our 32nd state on this list is Oklahoma, which happens to be just north of Texas. Out of Oklahoma City, you can drive 3 hours for Six Flags Over Texas, which is a great park for roller coasters. That's not even to mention Frontier City in the state's capital, and Silver Dollar City in Missouri being a 5-hour drive away. Looking at the variety of parks across several different states around Oklahoma, there are certainly worse places to be in for coasters. Further south is the state number 31, and that's Alabama. I decided to rank this state quite a bit higher than Mississippi and Louisiana because you're now closer to some of the bigger parks in bordering states. Out of Birmingham, you'll only have to drive 2 hours from Six Flags Over Georgia and 4.5 for Dollywood in Tennessee. Plus, Alabama Adventure is like right there if you want to ride Rampage. The real struggle comes in if you live near the Alabama coast, which then you'll only have OWA and an increased drive time for these bigger parks. If you have to live in Alabama, aim to be as north as possible for the best results. Next up at spot number 30 is the beautiful Colorado. This state has a decent collection of coasters, but nothing too special, though you have the opportunity to drive to Lagoon in nearby Utah. Otherwise, there's not much surrounding Colorado, so most enthusiasts will probably just have to rely on what's between their borders. Next up is a rather interesting state based off of where you live, and that's the upper Midwestern state of Michigan. Now let's assume you live in Detroit. Boom, jackpot, because you are only 2 hours from Cedar Point in Ohio, arguably the best park for roller coasters in the world. In most situations, you'll also be relatively close to Michigan's Adventure, which shivering timbers might not make it so bad. That said, if you live on the northern part of Michigan away from both of those parks, things suddenly become a whole heck of a lot worse. Then again, I've never actually met someone who lives up there, so chances are you'll be totally fine if you live in Michigan. Sticking with the Midwest is an up-and-coming state for roller coasters, which is Iowa. Here you automatically have Adventureland in Des Moines and Lost Island in Waterloo, so not a bad start at all. Then you can also drive the 5 to 6 hours to Chicago for Great America, Minneapolis for Valley Fair and Nick Universe, or Kansas City for Worlds of Fun. Honestly, there's some variety here, so things might not be so bad if you're living in Iowa. At 27 is Minnesota, another state that I love, and here you have a decent lineup between borders and some more variety in nearby states. First, Valley Fair and Nickelodeon Universe are two great parks with some fun rides on offer. Then, if you wish to travel to Wisconsin, there is a whole bunch of wooden coasters waiting for you there. You might also be interested in traveling to Iowa for Adventureland, as I mentioned prior. Our first New England state is going to be the northernmost one, Maine. This state only has some okay options between borders, with Excalibur at Funtown Splashtown and Sea Viper at Palace Playland. It isn't until you travel to neighboring states and countries where the possibilities become a bit more deep. Still, I wouldn't say any nearby parks are too amazing, but you've still got La Ronde not too far away in Canada, as well as Storyland in New Hampshire, and you are also driving distance from the major New England parks of Massachusetts and Connecticut. Lastly, at number 25, we've got Vermont. This brings you even closer to La Ronde in Canada, and not far from Great Escape in New York as well. Other than that, it has the same pros and cons as Maine. With that being said, those were our first 25 states to be featured in this long list of states with the closest proximity to the most roller coasters. I hope you all enjoyed this video topic, and I ask that you stay tuned for part 2 coming in just a few days. I had a lot of fun making this, so don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in part 2.